a woolly mammoth frozen solid inside Alaskan permafrost can look, when you finally get to it, almost fresh. Fur intact, stomach contents intact, the last meal it ever ate still identifiable, grasses, sedges, maybe a few wildflowers. That is not a rumor or an exaggeration. It is what gold miners in interior Alaska have been pulling out of the ground for well over a century. And that is where this story lives, right at the collision point between industrial gold mining and the deep, buried Ice Age. Because the same frozen ground that locked away ancient treasure for tens of thousands of years is now being cut open by high-pressure water cannons. What spills out is extraordinary. Tusks, bones, whole carcasses, animals that died before the pyramids were a thought, preserved so perfectly that the science world keeps having to update what it knows about life on Earth during the Pleistocene. Today I want to take you into the Alaskan Boneyard. We are going to talk about how these animals get found, what condition they are actually in when they emerge, what they have been teaching us about the world that existed here before the ice retreated, and why the mystery at the center of all of it, how these creatures went extinct, is still not fully settled. The deeper you dig into this one, literally and figuratively, the stranger it gets. So let us start with the ground itself, because the ground is the whole story. Interior Alaska sits on top of permafrost, permanently frozen soil and sediment that in some places runs hundreds of feet deep. This is not just cold dirt. It is a time capsule, built one frozen layer at a time over tens of thousands of years. Mixed into it is something locals and geologists call muck, a dark, organic-rich frozen sediment absolutely loaded with the remains of ancient life. Bones, plant material, pollen, insects, hair, and yes, sometimes entire animals, locked in place the moment they died or were buried. Now here is what makes Alaska different from, say, digging up a fossil in the American Southwest. Down in the desert, you are finding mineralized bone, stone-hard impressions left behind after the original material has long since been replaced by minerals over millions of years. What comes out of Alaskan permafrost is not fossilized in that sense. It is preserved, actual original tissue, actual original bone, collagen, keratin. In the most spectacular cases, you are dealing with something that looks less like a fossil and more like a very, very old piece of biology that just needed time to thaw. And the tool that thaws it? The hydraulic monitor. Think of it as a fire hose turned up to an almost industrial scale. A high-pressure water cannon that miners use to blast through frozen muck and gravel in search of the gold-bearing layers underneath. The Fairbanks district of interior Alaska has been mined this way for well over 100 years, and the process has an unavoidable side effect. It digs up everything else that was frozen in there alongside the gold. For a long time, miners treated the bones as a nuisance, a delay in the workday, something to move aside and get on with it. But even in the early 20th century, word started getting out to universities and museums that something remarkable was happening in these cuts. Collectors and scientists began showing up, arrangements were made, and over the following decades, the Alaskan permafrost became one of the most productive sources of Pleistocene megafauna specimens anywhere on Earth. Megafauna, that just means large animals, and the Pleistocene was practically overflowing with them. The world that existed in this part of North America until roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago was almost alien by modern standards. Woolly mammoths, obviously, those are the headliners. But alongside them lived steppe bison with horn spans that dwarf anything alive today, ancient horses, short-faced bears that would have made a modern grizzly look modest, camels, yes, camels, ancient relatives of the ones you are picturing, native to North America, and ground sloths the size of small cars. Alaska during the Ice Age was not a barren wasteland. Counterintuitively, it was one of the most productive grassland ecosystems on the planet, a vast cold steppe that supported enormous herds of large animals, and those animals, when they died and sank into the frozen ground, stayed there. Perfectly, eerily, beautifully preserved. One of the most famous finds to come out of this region is an animal known as blue babe, a steppe bison discovered near Fairbanks, preserved in permafrost so completely that its skin, hair, and even the scratch marks from a predator attack were still visible on the carcass. The paleontologist who worked most extensively on that specimen, based at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, determined that a lion, specifically the American lion, a now extinct species, had attacked and partly consumed the bison before it was frozen and locked away. Tens of thousands of years later, scientists sat down and essentially reconstructed the last hours of an Ice Age bison's life from the evidence the permafrost had kept for them. That is not archaeology. That is something closer to forensics across geological time. The Blue Babe specimen was discovered in 1979 during placer gold mining operations, and paleontologist R. Dale Guthrie led the detailed analysis published in his 1990 book Frozen Fauna of the Mammoth Steppe. Guthrie and his colleagues found claw marks consistent with Panthera atrox, the American lion, pressed into the hide near the bison's hindquarters. The animal had been partially fed upon and then abandoned, likely frozen over rapidly in a late Pleistocene cold snap around 36,000 years ago. Guthrie's team even held a dinner at which they tasted a small portion of the bison's neck meat, prepared as a stew, making Blue Babe arguably the only Ice Age megafauna specimen ever sampled as food by the scientists who studied it. And mammoths come up constantly. Tusks are the most common find. They are large and dense, and survive remarkably well. But full or partial carcasses have come up too, some with skin and muscle intact, some with the stomach contents preserved well enough to identify the specific plants the animal had been grazing on in its final days. There is something almost unbearable about that detail. You can look at a creature that walked this landscape during the last Ice Age and know, specifically, what it had for its last meal. That kind of intimacy with deep time is almost without parallel anywhere in science. Now, the miners who do this work tend to develop an eye for what to look for. A curve of dark material in the cut face of a muckbank might be a tusk. A dense patch of hair might signal a carcass below. The water cannon is paused. Someone climbs in carefully. The University of Alaska Museum and other institutions have worked over the years to build relationships with the mining community so that significant specimens can be recovered properly rather than lost. It is an imperfect system. Not every find gets reported. Not every bone makes it to a lab. But enough has come through that the scientific record from Alaskan permafrost is genuinely extraordinary. Here is where the story gets even more interesting, and this is the part I find genuinely mind-bending. The preservation quality of some of these specimens is good enough that scientists have been able to extract ancient DNA, not reconstructed DNA, not inferred sequences, actual ancient genetic material pulled from muscle tissue or hair follicles that has survived for tens of thousands of years because it was frozen almost immediately after death and never thawed. That ancient DNA has been used to map the genetic diversity of woolly mammoth populations, to understand how their numbers rose and fell over time in response to climate shifts, and to compare them closely with their nearest living relatives. We now know, in remarkable detail, how mammoth populations were structured, where different groups migrated, when certain lineages went locally extinct, and how isolated populations on islands like Wrangel Island off the Siberian coast managed to survive long after their mainland cousins had vanished, only to eventually disappear too, in the most recent geological blink of an eye. The Wrangel Island mammoths are a particularly striking case. Radiocarbon dating has placed their extinction at roughly 4,000 years ago, meaning that while the ancient Egyptians were constructing the pyramids at Giza and the Minoan civilization was flourishing in the Aegean, a small, genetically isolated population of woolly mammoths was still alive on an Arctic island, roughly 140 kilometers north of the Siberian mainland. A 2017 study, led by Rebecca Rogers and Montgomery Slatkin, analyzed the Wrangel Island mammoth genome and found clear signatures of genomic deterioration, mutations accumulating in genes related to neurological development, male fertility, and insulin signaling, consistent with what happens when a small, inbred population has been cut off from outside genetic diversity for thousands of years. The island was their refuge and their trap simultaneously. And because I want to be honest with you here, some of this genetic work is actively ongoing, and what is well established versus what is still being worked out shifts regularly. I am not going to pretend the science is all settled. It is not. But the broad picture that has emerged from Alaskan permafrost specimens, combined with finds from Siberia and the Yukon, is one of the richest portraits of a lost world ever assembled, which brings us to the extinction question, because that is the mystery that never quite goes away. If you spend any time reading about the end of the Pleistocene, you will run into two camps with strong opinions. One argues that the extinction of the megafauna, not just mammoths, but dozens of species across North and South America, Australia, and elsewhere, was primarily driven by climate change as the last glacial maximum ended and the world warmed. The mammoth steppe shrank, the great grasslands fragmented, the food supply collapsed for animals that had evolved over millions of years to exploit that specific ecosystem. The other camp points at humans. The timing is uncomfortable. Modern humans arrived in the Americas right around when the megafauna started disappearing. The hunting pressure hypothesis, sometimes called the overkill hypothesis, suggests that even relatively small groups of skilled hunters could have collapsed megafauna populations over generations, especially for animals like mammoths that reproduce slowly and invest heavily in individual offspring. Paul Martin, the University of Arizona ecologist who formalized the overkill hypothesis in the 1960s and 1970s, argued that the wave of extinctions followed the front of human migration through the continents with uncomfortable precision, approximately 40 genera of large mammals vanishing from the Americas within roughly 1,000 to 2,000 years of the first confirmed evidence of human presence. His critics noted that 1,000 years is also the timescale on which dramatic climate shifts were occurring, and the debate has never fully resolved. A 2023 meta-analysis published in Nature Communications, drawing on hundreds of radiocarbon dates from megafauna specimens and archaeological sites across 5 continents, concluded that human arrival was the strongest single predictor of extinction timing, but that climate instability significantly amplified the effect. Neither factor alone explains the full pattern. Most serious researchers today will tell you it was probably both, working together, and that the balance between those two pressures probably varied by region and by species. But I will tell you this: the permafrost specimens keep complicating the picture. Every time a new carcass comes up with intact stomach contents, or a new DNA sequence gets pulled from a Fairbanks specimen, the timeline shifts a little. Some animals we thought were gone earlier turn out to have hung on longer in refugia, small, isolated pockets of suitable habitat. The extinction of the woolly mammoth was not a single event. It was a long, drawn-out, geographically uneven process, and we are still mapping it. And there is one more layer to this that I cannot ignore, because it has become part of the public conversation around these Alaskan finds. The quality of DNA preservation from permafrost specimens has made the woolly mammoth the flagship target of what some scientists call de-extinction, the effort to use ancient genetic material, combined with the genome of living relatives, to resurrect something functionally close to a mammoth. Whether that is philosophically a good idea, scientifically feasible, or ecologically meaningful is a debate I will leave to you. But the raw material for that project, the genetic library, comes largely from animals, like the ones being washed out of Alaskan muckbanks by water cannons right now. The Ice Age Boneyard is not just a record of the past. Some people think it might be a blueprint for something in the future. Colossal Biosciences, the Dallas-based company founded in 2021 by geneticist George Church and entrepreneur Ben Novak, has explicitly named the woolly mammoth as its primary de-extinction target, citing a goal of producing cold-adapted elephant-mammoth hybrids capable of surviving on the Siberian steppe within roughly a decade. The scientific mechanism they are pursuing involves CRISPR gene editing to introduce key mammoth traits: subcutaneous fat distribution, cold-adapted hemoglobin, reduced ear size for heat retention, and shaggy hair, into the genome of Asian elephants, which share approximately 99.6% of their DNA with woolly mammoths. The genetic sequences they are working with come substantially from permafrost-preserved specimens, including material extracted from Siberian and Alaskan finds. Whether the end product would truly be a mammoth in any meaningful ecological sense, or a heavily edited elephant, remains one of the more lively arguments in contemporary conservation biology. Before I get to the close, let me say, if you are the kind of person who finds this fascinating, and I suspect you are because you are still here, this channel is built exactly for you. Subscribe to the Thaw Line if you have not already. We go into the deep end on topics like this every week, and the community of people who show up for these conversations makes it worth every second of research. Now, back to Alaska. What strikes me most about the Alaskan boneyard, when I sit with all of this, is the sheer randomness of survival and loss. A mammoth dies. Maybe it is old, maybe it falls through thin ice over a pond, maybe it gets mired in mud near a stream bank and cannot get out. it sinks into the frozen ground. For 10,000 years, or 20,000, or 40,000, the world above it changes beyond all recognition. Human civilizations rise and fall. Languages are born and go extinct. The Roman Empire comes and goes. Then one afternoon a water cannon punches through a frozen muck bank in the Fairbanks district, and a tusk rolls out, still amber-colored, still dense, still faintly smelling of something ancient. The miner pauses, picks it up, turns it over in his hands. He is holding an animal's last day, a fragment of a world that existed here before anyone alive today can imagine it. A world of towering grass, of great herds, of lions and bison and mammoths moving across a cold steppe that stretched from Siberia to the Yukon without a break in the land. And that world is not entirely gone. It is frozen beneath our feet, and every year, as the permafrost thaws, both from mining and increasingly from the warming climate, more of it surfaces, more of that lost world comes back into the light. The question of what we do with it, what it tells us, and whether we truly understand yet what was lost when the Ice Age ended, that remains genuinely open. And honestly, I think I prefer it that way. Some mysteries are better for being slightly beyond reach. So here is what I want to ask you, and I want you to drop your answer in the comments below. When you look at all of this, the climate evidence, the timing of human arrival, the DNA data from permafrost specimens, where do you land on the extinction question? Climate, human hunting, or something in between that we have not fully named yet? I read every comment, and on a topic like this, your perspective genuinely matters to me. If this kind of deep dive is your thing, our next video goes into the frozen mummies of the high Andes, a very different kind of cold preservation, and a story with some genuinely unsettling details about what the Inca were doing at altitude that the archaeology has only recently started to clarify. You will not want to miss it. Subscribe to the Thaw Line if you are not already part of this community. We are here every week, digging into the strange corners of the ancient world. Until next time, keep asking the questions that go all the way down.